She's just the babysitter, Jensen Arlington laughed into his phone, adjusting his tie in our bedroom mirror. Yeah, I know she lives here, but trust me, Camilla, she's basically hired help who looks after the kids, nothing more. I stood frozen in the hallway, our 2-year-old Emma sleeping peacefully in my arms after her nightmare. My husband of 8 years had just reduced me to domestic staff for his mistress. I smiled, turned around quietly, and walked back to the nursery without a word.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're a subscriber, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Tell us a duh.
24 hours later, Camilla Ford would discover exactly who she'd been sharing a bed with. A married man whose babysitter had a marriage certificate, joint bank accounts, and enough evidence to destroy both their lives forever. But let me start from the beginning, because this story isn't just about catching a cheating husband. It's about how a man who thought he could rewrite history learned that his wife had been writing down every single lie along the way. My name is Alyssa Hanson Arlington, though Jensen conveniently dropped the hyphen when introducing me to his colleagues and apparently his girlfriends. For 8 years, I'd been Mrs. Arlington in every legal document, every school form, every medical record for our children. But somewhere along the way, Jensen had started treating me like temporary staff in my own home. The signs had been there for months, though I'd been too exhausted to piece them together initially. Working from home as a freelance graphic designer while managing our household and raising Emma and 6-year-old Harry had left me running on fumes most days. Jensen's new position as regional sales director for Arlington Construction, yes, his family's company, meant longer hours, more business trips, and an increasing number of client dinners that stretched well into the night. I trusted him completely. After all, we'd built this life together from nothing. When we met in college, Jensen was just another business major with big dreams and a famous last name he was desperate to live up to. His grandfather had founded Arlington Construction, his father had expanded it across 3 states, and Jensen carried the weight of family expectations on his shoulders like a lead blanket. I'd been the one working 2 jobs to support us while he interned unpaid at the family company. I'd been the one who moved across the country when his father offered him a real position. I'd been the one who put my own career ambitions on hold when Harry was born, then again when Emma came along. But apparently, in Jensen's revised version of our history, I was just the help. The phone call I'd overheard that Tuesday night changed everything. Not just because of the affair, though that cut deep enough, but because of how casually he'd erased me from our own story. She's just the babysitter. The words echoed in my mind as I tucked Emma back into her crib and kissed Harry's forehead in the next room. These weren't just the babysitter's children, they were our children, my children. I'd stood in that hallway for a long time after the call ended, listening to Jensen's voice carry through the bedroom door as he made plans to meet Camilla at some hotel downtown. The same hotel where we'd celebrated our 5th anniversary 3 years ago. The irony wasn't lost on me. That night marked the beginning of what I now call my documentation period. If Jensen wanted to pretend I was just hired help, I'd start keeping records like any good employee would. Every late night, every suspicious phone call, every lie about working late, I began tracking it all with the methodical precision of someone who'd learned not to trust her own instincts anymore. The first piece of evidence came 3 days later when Jensen left his laptop open on the kitchen counter. A message thread with someone named C contained months of conversations that made my stomach turn. But it was one particular exchange that burned itself into my memory. "Does your wife suspect anything?" Camilla had asked. Jensen's response was swift and cruel. "What wife? Alyssa's just the live-in natty. She knows her place." Her place. I'd read those words over and over until they lost all meaning. My place, apparently, was to be invisible in my own marriage, while my husband rewrote our entire relationship for his convenience. I screenshot the conversation before Jensen returned from his shower, then began systematically going through our shared devices, our financial records, our entire digital life together. What I found painted a picture of deception so elaborate that I had to admire its audacity, even as it shattered my heart. Hotel receipts charged to his company card for business meetings that coincided perfectly with his mysterious late nights. Dinner reservations for two at romantic restaurants I'd never seen. Jewelry purchases that never made it home to me. Credit card statements showing a pattern of spending that suggested he'd been living an entirely separate life for at least 6 months. But the most damning evidence came from Jensen himself. In his arrogance, he'd been documenting his own affair through photos, messages, and even voice notes he'd saved in his phone, including several recordings where he complained to Camilla about having to deal with the babysitter drama when I'd asked him to help with bedtime routines or attend Harry's school events. The babysitter drama. I'd been married to this man for 8 years, borne his children, supported his career, managed his household, and maintained his social calendar. But asking him to be present for his own family constituted drama from the hired help. As I sat in our home office that first week, organizing the evidence into carefully labeled folders on my laptop, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't devastated anymore. I was angry. And anger, I discovered, was much more useful than heartbreak. Jensen had underestimated me in the cruelest possible way. He'd assumed that 8 years of marriage had made me dependent, compliant, invisible. He'd gambled that his babysitter would never have the courage or capability to challenge his new narrative. He was about to learn exactly how wrong he was. Because while Jensen Arlington was busy playing house with his mistress, his wife, his actual legal wife, was building a case that would expose every lie he'd told and every law he'd broken in the process. The babysitter was about to show him exactly what she was capable of when she stopped pretending to be anyone other than Mrs. Jensen Arlington. What Jensen didn't know was that his carefully constructed double life was about to implode in the most spectacular way possible. In exactly 3 weeks, during the quarterly family barbecue at his parents' estate, Camilla Ford would walk up to me with a smug smile and ask when I'd be putting the children to bed so the adults could talk. She'd pat my shoulder condescendingly and suggest I should consider taking some college courses to better myself for future employment opportunities. 20 minutes later, she'd be fleeing the party in tears after I handed her a manila envelope containing our marriage certificate, joint tax returns, and copies of the family trust documents naming me as Jensen's legal spouse and beneficiary. The same documents that listed her as an unnamed co-conspirator in what my lawyer Arthur Tanner would later describe as systematic financial fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The path to that moment required 3 weeks of careful planning, meticulous documentation, and the kind of strategic thinking Jensen had never bothered to credit me with. After all, in his mind, babysitters don't go to law school. They don't understand financial structures or contract law. They certainly don't have the connections or intelligence to build airtight legal cases. Jensen had forgotten that before we were married, before I became his children's mother, before I transformed into his invisible domestic manager, I was Alyssa Hansen, the woman who'd graduated summa cum laude from Northwestern with a double major in business and communications. The same woman who'd worked at Chicago's most prestigious corporate law firm before choosing to freelance so I could be present for our children's early years. He'd forgotten because it served his narrative to forget. In Jensen's rewritten history, he was the successful executive who'd graciously provided employment to some random woman who happened to live in his house and care for his children. The fact that this random woman had connections throughout the legal and business communities of our city had apparently slipped his mind entirely. My brother Ron Hansen worked as a private investigator specializing in corporate fraud cases. My college roommate Kate Baker had become one of the city's top family law attorneys. My former boss at the law firm, Arthur Tanner, now ran his own practice and owed me several favors from cases where my research had saved his clients millions.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
While Jensen saw me as isolated and dependent, I was actually embedded in a network of professionals who could dismantle his lies with surgical precision. The same social invisibility he'd cultivated around me would become his downfall, because when you don't see someone as a threat, you don't bother hiding your vulnerabilities from them. The morning after I'd overheard that first phone call, I'd made a series of very quiet, very strategic calls of my own. Ron agreed to conduct surveillance on Jensen's movements, though he insisted on doing it pro bono. "Family doesn't pay family," he'd said grimly when I explained the situation. Kate scheduled a confidential consultation to discuss my legal options, her voice tight with controlled fury when I described Jensen's babysitter comments. Arthur offered his services immediately, his decades of experience in high-stakes corporate litigation already mapping out potential strategies. "Alyssa," Arthur had said during our first meeting, "if what you're telling me is accurate, Jensen isn't just cheating on you personally. He's potentially defrauding the family business, misappropriating company resources, and creating massive liability issues for Arlington Construction. This goes far beyond a simple divorce case." That conversation changed everything. What had started as heartbreak over a cheating husband suddenly became something much larger and more dangerous. Jensen wasn't just betraying our marriage, he was risking the entire Arlington family legacy through his reckless behavior. Using company funds for personal affairs, charging personal expenses to business accounts, potentially exposing the company to sexual harassment lawsuits. The implications were staggering. Over the next few days, I began to understand the full scope of Jensen's deception. He'd been living like a bachelor while married, spending like a single man while claiming tax benefits as a married father, and presenting himself to business contacts as unattached while using his family connections to advance his career. The hotel receipts I'd found weren't just evidence of an affair, they represented fraudulent expense reports filed with Arlington Construction. The jewelry purchases showed a pattern of using joint credit accounts for gifts to his mistress, essentially forcing me to pay for my husband's betrayal through our shared finances. The restaurant charges revealed that Jensen had been entertaining Camilla at establishments where he was known as a married family man, creating potential witnesses to his double life. But perhaps most damaging of all were the text messages I'd recovered from his phone's backup files. Messages where Jensen had explicitly told Camilla that he was technically single and that his living situation was temporary until the nanny contract expired. He'd promised her they could move in together once he'd resolved the childcare situation and found alternative arrangements for Harry and Emma. Alternative arrangements? My children, our children, had become inconvenient obstacles in Jensen's fantasy romance. He was planning to dissolve our family as casually as someone might change their cable subscription, all while pretending to Camilla that he'd never made any serious commitments to anyone. The most chilling part was how systematic it all seemed. This wasn't a moment of weakness or a brief lapse in judgment. Jensen had constructed an elaborate alternate reality where our 8-year marriage, our 2 children, and our entire shared life simply didn't exist. He'd been living this lie for months, possibly longer, with the kind of detailed consistency that suggested he'd completely compartmentalized his conscience. As I sat in Arthur's office that first week, reviewing the evidence we'd gathered, I realized that Jensen had made a critical error in his calculations. He'd assumed that reducing me to just the babysitter would make me powerless, invisible, irrelevant. Instead, it had freed me from any obligation to protect his reputation, his career, or his relationships. After all, babysitters don't owe their employers loyalty when they discover criminal activity. Employees have no obligation to cover up their boss's fraud. And when you're just the help, nobody expects you to prioritize your employer's interests over your own survival and your children's welfare. Jensen was about to learn that dismissing someone doesn't make them disappear. It just makes them stop caring about the consequences of their actions. And I was planning consequences he'd never seen coming. The irony of Jensen's babysitter narrative was that he'd actually lived through my transformation from successful professional to devoted mother, yet somehow convinced himself it had never happened. Perhaps it was easier for him to rewrite history than acknowledge what he'd asked me to sacrifice for our family. When we met at Northwestern, I wasn't some starry-eyed undergraduate impressed by his family name. I was already working as a research assistant for Professor Margaret Chen, one of the country's leading experts in corporate law. My senior thesis on fiduciary duty and breach of trust had been published in the Northwestern Law Review, a distinction that typically launched students directly into top-tier law programs or prestigious firm positions. I'd chosen the corporate track at Morrison Klein & Associates specifically because their client list included several Fortune 500 companies embroiled in complex fraud cases. My analytical skills and attention to detail had made me invaluable to the partners within my first year. Arthur Tanner, then a senior partner, had personally requested me for his most sensitive cases because I could spot discrepancies in financial records that seasoned auditors missed. But Jensen never saw that version of me professionally. By the time we were serious enough for him to visit my workplace, I was already scaling back my hours to accommodate his needs. He had evening networking events where he needed a polished girlfriend, weekend family obligations where his parents expected to meet his serious relationship, vacation trips that aligned with his schedule, not mine. I'd convinced myself it was temporary, just until he established himself at Arlington Construction, just until we figured out our long-term plans, just until the timing was better for both our careers. The compromises felt reasonable at first. What couple doesn't adjust their priorities when they're building a future together? When Jensen proposed during his second year at the company, I was already working primarily remote assignments that allowed me flexibility around his schedule. When we married, I'd transitioned to freelance consulting so I could travel with him for business conferences and family events. When Harry was born, I'd stepped away from consulting entirely to focus on our growing family. Each transition felt logical in isolation. Jensen was earning more than I could as a consultant. His family business provided security and benefits. My skills weren't going anywhere. I could always return to corporate law when the children were older. We were building something together, making sacrifices for our shared future. But somewhere in that process, Jensen had stopped seeing my choices as sacrifices and started viewing them as evidence of my natural limitations. The successful attorney who'd chosen to prioritize family became, in his mind, someone who'd never been capable of more than domestic work in the first place. This revisionist thinking extended to every aspect of our relationship. When we'd bought our house, I'd negotiated the purchase agreement and identified potential structural issues that saved us $30,000. But in Jensen's current narrative, he'd handled all the important details while I'd focused on decorating decisions. When I'd restructured our investment portfolio during the market downturn and protected our retirement funds, he'd later described it as following advice from our financial advisor, with no mention of the hours I'd spent researching market trends and reallocating assets. Most significantly, when Harry started having learning difficulties in kindergarten and I'd researched educational specialists, coordinated testing, and developed an intervention plan that transformed his academic performance, Jensen had told his parents that the school finally figured out what was wrong and fixed it. My role in advocating for our son had been completely erased from his version of events. This pattern of erasure hadn't happened overnight. It was a gradual process that accelerated once Jensen became more prominent at Arlington Construction. His colleagues saw him as a successful executive with a traditional wife who managed their household, a perfectly respectable arrangement that required no further explanation. Over time, Jensen had apparently started believing his own simplified version of our dynamic. The transformation was so subtle that I hadn't fully recognized it myself until I heard him describing me as just the babysitter. That phrase crystallized years of small dismissals, casual corrections to my contributions, and strategic omissions of my professional background when introducing me to new people. But while Jensen had been busy rewriting our history, he'd forgotten that the skills that made me valuable at Morrison Klein & Associates hadn't disappeared. They'd been redirected towards managing our household, our finances, our children's needs, and our social obligations. The same analytical thinking that had impressed corporate partners was now applied to optimizing our family's complex logistics. The organizational systems I developed for major litigation cases had evolved into color-coded calendars that tracked everything from Jensen's work schedule to Harry's therapy appointments to Emma's developmental milestones. The research techniques I'd used to build legal arguments were now focused on finding the best pediatricians, negotiating better insurance coverage, and identifying investment opportunities for the children's college funds. Most significantly, when Harry started having learning difficulties in kindergarten, and I'd researched educational specialists, coordinated testing, and developed an intervention plan that transformed his academic performance, Jensen had told his parents that the school finally figured out what was wrong and fixed it. My role in advocating for our son had been completely erased from his version of events. This pattern of erasure hadn't happened overnight. It was a gradual process that accelerated once Jensen became more prominent at Arlington Construction. His colleagues saw him as a successful executive with a traditional wife who managed their household, a perfectly respectable arrangement that required no further explanation. Over time, Jensen had apparently started believing his own simplified version of our dynamic. The transformation was so subtle that I hadn't fully recognized it myself until I heard him describing me as just the babysitter. That phrase crystallized years of small dismissals, casual corrections to my contributions, and strategic omissions of my professional background when introducing me to new people. But while Jensen had been busy rewriting our history, he'd forgotten that the skills that made me valuable at Morris & Klein & Associates hadn't disappeared. They'd been redirected towards managing our household, our finances, our children's needs, and our social obligations. The same analytical thinking that had impressed corporate partners was now applied to optimizing our family's complex logistics. The organizational systems I'd developed for major litigation cases had evolved into color-coded calendars that tracked everything from Jensen's work schedule to Harry's therapy appointments to Emma's developmental milestones. The research techniques I'd used to build legal arguments were now focused on finding the best pediatricians, negotiating better insurance coverage, and identifying investment opportunities for the children's college funds.
Most importantly, the investigative instincts that had helped me uncover corporate fraud were still perfectly intact. Jensen had made the fatal error of assuming that someone focused on domestic concerns couldn't also be analyzing patterns, documenting discrepancies, and building comprehensive cases when necessary. He'd also forgotten that my professional network hadn't disappeared when I stepped away from corporate law. Former colleagues still called for advice on complex cases. My undergraduate professors still recommended me for consulting projects that I declined due to family obligations. Professional relationships I'd built over years of excellent work remained strong, even if they were temporarily inactive. When I'd called Ron, Kate, and Arthur that first week, none of them had been surprised to hear from me. They'd all expressed concern that I'd been too quiet in recent years, and Ron had even mentioned wondering if everything was okay at home because I'd seemed increasingly isolated from my usual social connections. Their immediate willingness to help wasn't just professional courtesy. It was recognition that the Alyssa Hansen they'd known as a brilliant analyst and devoted friend was still there, temporarily obscured by the demands of marriage and motherhood, but not diminished by them. Jensen's critical miscalculation was assuming that choosing to prioritize family meant I'd lost the capability for anything else. In reality, it meant I'd gained 8 years of experience managing complex projects, navigating interpersonal dynamics, and solving problems under pressure while maintaining dozens of competing priorities simultaneously. Running a household with 2 young children while supporting a spouse's demanding career requires exactly the same skills as managing major corporate litigation: attention to detail, strategic planning, resource allocation, crisis management, and the ability to anticipate problems before they become disasters. The difference was that now I'd be applying those skills to protect my children's future instead of Jensen's reputation. And unlike corporate clients who paid for my discretion, Jensen had forfeited any expectation of loyalty when he'd reduced me to hired help in conversations with his mistress. He was about to rediscover exactly who Alyssa Hansen had been before she became Mrs. Arlington, and why her former colleague had considered her one of the most formidable opponents they'd ever faced in negotiations. The art of becoming invisible while remaining present required skills I'd never expected to need in my marriage. But Jensen had made it clear that my professional background was an inconvenience to his preferred narrative, so I'd learned to deflect questions and downplay my capabilities with the same precision I'd once used to build legal arguments. When Arlington Construction hosted their annual client appreciation dinner and partners' wives were expected to make polite conversation,
I'd perfected the art of humble deflection. When someone mentioned my obvious intelligence or asked about my background, I'd smile warmly and redirect the conversation back to their interests. "Oh, I just picked up a few things over the years," became my standard response to compliments about my business insights. "Jensen's the real expert. I just listen well." When clients asked about my opinion on market trends or regulatory changes that I could have discussed for hours, I'd defer to Jensen with practiced modesty. "You should really ask my husband about that. He's much better with the complicated stuff." Jensen loved this version of me, the supportive wife who made him look brilliant by comparison, who never upstaged him in professional settings, who enhanced his reputation as a successful man with excellent judgment in all areas of life. He'd beam proudly when colleagues commented on how fortunate he was to have such a devoted partner who clearly knew her role. At family gatherings with the Arlington clan, I'd refined this performance to an art form. Jensen's mother, Faith Arlington, had strong opinions about women who tried too hard to compete with their husbands professionally. She'd approve when I discussed menu planning for family events or shared anecdotes about the children's milestones, but her expression would cool noticeably if conversation drifted toward anything that might showcase independent thinking or professional knowledge. "Alyssa's wonderfully domestic," Faith would tell visiting relatives. "So refreshing to meet a young woman who understands what really matters in life." Jensen would nod approvingly during these conversations, apparently forgetting that his mother's praise was based on a carefully curated version of my personality designed to maintain family harmony. At family gatherings with the Arlington clan, I'd refined this performance to an art form. Jensen's mother, Faith Arlington, had strong opinions about women who tried too hard to compete with their husbands professionally. She'd approve when I discussed menu planning for family events or shared anecdotes about the children's milestones, but her expression would cool noticeably if conversation drifted toward anything that might showcase independent thinking or professional knowledge. "Alyssa's wonderfully domestic," Faith would tell visiting relatives. "So refreshing to meet a young woman who understands what really matters in life." Jensen would nod approvingly during these conversations, apparently forgetting that his mother's praise was based on a carefully curated version of my personality designed to maintain family harmony. Even my own friends had gradually accepted this diminished version of my identity. When Kate invited me to professional networking events, I'd decline with explanations about childcare responsibilities or Jensen's schedule conflicts. When former colleagues called with consulting opportunities, I'd express gratitude but explain that my current priorities didn't allow for additional commitments. Over time, these deflections became so automatic that I sometimes wondered if I was losing touch with my professional identity entirely. There were moments when I'd catch myself genuinely believing that perhaps I wasn't as capable as I'd once thought. Maybe my success at Morrison Klein and Associates had been circumstantial. Maybe I'd been fortunate to work with exceptional teams that made me look better than I actually was. Jensen certainly seemed to believe this revised version of my capabilities. When we'd refinanced our mortgage last year, he'd handled all the paperwork, despite my superior understanding of contract terms and interest rate structures. "Don't worry about the details, babe," he'd said when I'd asked to review the documents. "This is pretty technical stuff. I've got it covered." When Harry needed educational testing, Jensen had initially dismissed my research about learning specialists and assessment options. "Let's just go with whoever the school recommends," he'd suggested. "No need to overthink this." Only when the school's chosen professional proved inadequate and I'd quietly arranged for a comprehensive evaluation that identified Harry's specific needs, had Jensen acknowledged that my approach might have merit. Even then, he'd framed it as lucky intuition rather than thorough research and analysis. The most challenging aspect of maintaining this disguise was suppressing my instinctive responses during business conversations that occurred in social settings. When Jensen's colleagues discussed deals I could see were structured poorly or complained about legal issues that had obvious solutions, every professional instinct urged me to offer insights that could help them avoid costly mistakes. But Jensen's subtle corrections had trained me to stay quiet. A gentle touch on my arm when I started to speak, a slight shake of his head when I seemed about to contribute to discussions he considered beyond my expertise, a quick change of subject when my knowledge became too apparent, these small redirections had effectively silenced me in professional contexts. The irony was that Jensen's colleagues often seemed disappointed by my reticence. During a dinner party at our house, Arthur Tanner had specifically asked about my perspective on a complex contract dispute his firm was handling. I'd started to respond with what I knew would be valuable analysis, but Jensen had immediately interrupted with a joke about not boring the ladies with work talk, effectively shutting down the conversation. Arthur had given me a puzzled look, clearly remembering my capabilities from our previous professional relationship. But the social dynamics of the situation made it impossible for him to push back against Jensen's dismissal without creating awkwardness for everyone present. These interactions taught me that my professional invisibility wasn't just about personal humility, it was about maintaining Jensen's comfort level in social situations where my expertise might overshadow his. He needed to be the smartest person at his own dinner table, even if it meant wasting opportunities for meaningful business discussions that could have benefited everyone involved. The children had absorbed these dynamics as well. Harry had learned not to mention that Mommy helped him with math homework by explaining complex problems in ways his teachers couldn't. Emma had internalized the message that Daddy was the one who worked while Mommy played with them, despite witnessing me handle business calls and manage household finances with obvious competence. This systematic erosion of my professional identity had been so gradual that I hadn't fully recognized it until I've heard Jensen describing me as just the babysitter to Camilla. That phrase had crystallized years of careful diminishment, showing me how completely I'd allowed my capabilities to be redefined by someone else's comfort level. But the skills hadn't disappeared, they'd just been disguised. The same analytical thinking that Jensen now dismissed as overthinking had been quietly applied to managing our family's complex logistics, identifying problems before they became crises, and optimizing systems that kept our household running smoothly despite his demanding schedule.
The organizational abilities that had impressed corporate partners were now focused on coordinating multiple calendars, managing competing priorities, and ensuring that nothing important fell through the cracks of our busy family life. The negotiation skills that had helped resolve multi-million-dollar disputes were now used to handle everything from pediatrician appointments to school district policies to neighborhood association conflicts. Most significantly, the investigative instincts that had made me valuable in corporate fraud cases had been unconsciously monitoring discrepancies in Jensen's behavior for months before I'd consciously acknowledged what I was seeing. My professional training had been quietly documenting inconsistencies, noting pattern changes, and flagging potential problems long before my emotional awareness had caught up. Jensen's greatest mistake was assuming that professional skills could be permanently suppressed rather than temporarily redirected. He'd mistaken my willingness to defer to his preferences for actual inability to function independently. He'd confused my choice to prioritize family harmony with genuine intellectual limitations. Now that the marriage was revealed to be a facade, there was no reason to continue the performance. The professional capabilities Jensen had spent years carefully containing were about to be unleashed in service of protecting my children's future and securing my own survival. He was about to learn that making someone invisible doesn't eliminate their power, it just makes them harder to see coming. What Jensen had never understood was that being dismissed as just the babysitter actually granted me unprecedented access to information that wives typically never see. When you're considered hired help rather than a spouse, people stop guarding their conversations around you, they forget you're listening, they assume you lack the sophistication to understand the implications of what you're hearing. This invisibility had made me privy to details about Arlington Construction's operations that Jensen would never have shared with someone he considered his equal. During business calls that he took from home, he'd speak freely about sensitive deals, problematic clients, and questionable accounting practices, because he assumed his babysitter wasn't sophisticated enough to understand the significance. I'd learned that Arlington Construction had been struggling financially for the past 2 years, despite their public success narrative. The company had taken on several high-risk projects with razor-thin margins, and cost overruns were eating into profits across multiple job sites. Jensen's promotion to regional sales director came with pressure to generate revenue at any cost, including pursuing contracts that more experienced executives had flagged as potentially unprofitable. More concerning were the ethical shortcuts Jensen had started taking to meet his aggressive sales targets. I'd overheard him discussing strategies for inflating project estimates, using substandard materials while charging for premium specifications, and timing payment schedules to obscure cash flow problems. These weren't minor corner-cutting measures, they were systematic practices that could expose the company to massive liability if clients discovered the deception. But perhaps most valuable was my accidental access to Jensen's relationship with his father, Clay Arlington, the company's founder and current CEO. During family dinners when Clay visited our home, the two men would retreat to Jensen's study for private business discussions that I could hear clearly from the adjacent kitchen while preparing coffee or cleaning up. Clay had serious doubts about Jensen's judgment and capabilities. Despite the family connection, he'd expressed concerns about Jensen's impulsive decision-making and tendency to prioritize short-term gains over long-term stability. Most damaging of all, Clay had specifically mentioned that he was considering alternative succession plans that might not include Jensen in the company's future leadership. "The boy has potential," Clay had told his wife during one particularly frank conversation, "but he lacks the discipline and ethical foundation this company needs." "I've built Arlington Construction on trust and quality workmanship. Jensen seems more interested in quick profits and cutting corners." This information was devastating to Jensen's carefully constructed image as the heir apparent to Arlington Construction. His affair with Camilla wasn't just personal betrayal, it was professional suicide if it became public knowledge. The company's reputation depended on family values and community trust. A scandal involving fraudulent business practices and marital infidelity could destroy everything Clay had built over 4 decades.
Even more advantageous was my understanding of the company's financial structure, which I'd gained through managing our personal finances and reviewing tax documents that Jensen signed without reading carefully. Arlington Construction operated as a family trust with specific provisions about moral behavior and fiduciary responsibility. Beneficiaries could be removed from inheritance consideration if their actions brought public disgrace or financial liability to the company. Jensen apparently didn't realize that his wife had access to these documents through our joint tax filings, or that someone with my background could interpret the legal language that governed his potential inheritance. The affair with Camilla, combined with his fraudulent business practices, would trigger the trust's moral conduct clauses and potentially eliminate him from succession entirely. But my most significant advantage was emotional rather than informational. Jensen's systematic dismissal of my intelligence had freed me from any obligation to protect his interests. When someone reduces you to hired help, you stop feeling responsible for their reputation, their relationships, or their career prospects. You start thinking like an employee whose primary obligation is to your own survival and your children's welfare. This psychological freedom allowed me to approach the situation with analytical detachment rather than emotional investment. I wasn't trying to save my marriage or protect my husband. I was documenting evidence and building a legal case against someone who'd systematically deceived me while putting my children's future at risk. Jensen's financial recklessness with company resources had created joint tax liability that could affect my creditworthiness and financial stability for years. His affair had exposed me to potential health risks and emotional trauma. His fraudulent business practices could result in criminal charges that would destroy our family's reputation and security. Most importantly, his plan to abandon Harry and Emma once he'd resolved the childcare situation with Camilla represented a direct threat to my children's emotional and financial welfare. This wasn't just adultery, it was systematic abandonment of parental responsibilities in favor of a fantasy relationship built on lies. Understanding these stakes allowed me to approach evidence gathering with professional focus rather than personal anguish. Each document I copied, each conversation I recorded, each financial discrepancy I identified became part of a comprehensive case designed to protect my legal rights and my children's future. Jensen's greatest vulnerability was his assumption that I shared his interests and would naturally want to protect him from consequences. He'd built his entire deception strategy around the belief that his wife would prioritize family harmony over justice, personal loyalty over legal accountability. But I wasn't his wife anymore in any meaningful sense. I was someone he'd explicitly described as hired help who happened to live in his house. And employees have no obligation to cover up their employer's crimes, especially when those crimes threaten their own financial security and their children's welfare. The irony was perfect. Jensen's attempt to diminish my status had actually eliminated the emotional barriers that might have prevented me from taking decisive action against him. By reducing me to just the babysitter, he'd accidentally given me permission to prioritize my own interests over his, to document his wrongdoing without guilt, and to pursue justice without worrying about protecting his reputation. He was about to discover that dismissed people have nothing left to lose, and therefore no reason to show mercy to those who've underestimated them. The full scope of Jensen's betrayal became clear when I discovered the detailed timeline he'd created for dismantling our family. Hidden in his laptop's drafts folder was an email thread with Camilla that read like a business plan for destroying my life while maintaining plausible deniability. Phase 1 involved gradually reducing my role in social situations until I became completely invisible to his professional network. He'd been systematically excluding me from company events, telling colleagues that I preferred to stay home with the kids rather than admitting he no longer wanted me present. This isolation was designed to make my eventual disappearance from his life seem natural rather than shocking. Phase 2 focused on financial manipulation. Jensen had been redirecting money from our joint accounts into a separate investment portfolio that I didn't know existed. Over 18 months, he'd moved nearly $60,000, money that should have been securing our children's college funds, into accounts that only he could access. His plan was to create the appearance that our family was struggling financially, justifying his decision to simplify our living situation.
But Phase 3 was the most chilling part of his strategy. Jensen intended to file for divorce on grounds of irreconcilable differences, claiming that I'd become increasingly unstable and unable to cope with family responsibilities. He'd been documenting instances where I'd seemed overwhelmed or emotional, creating a narrative that would support his request for full custody of Harry and Emma. The children weren't obstacles to be eliminated, they were assets to be claimed. Jensen believed that maintaining custody would demonstrate his stability to his father and the Arlington Construction Board, proving he could handle complex responsibilities despite his personal troubles. Meanwhile, Camilla had been researching boarding schools and summer camps that would minimize the children's day-to-day impact on their new life together. Reading these messages felt like discovering that someone had been planning my murder in meticulous detail. Every argument we'd had, every moment of exhaustion I'd shown while managing household and parenting duties, every time I'd expressed frustration with Jensen's absence or neglect, all of it had been weaponized as evidence of my supposed incompetence as a wife and mother. The psychological manipulation was breathtaking in its complexity. Jensen had been deliberately creating additional stress in my life, then documenting my responses to that stress as proof of instability. When he'd forgotten to pick up Harry from school, forcing me to leave a client call and rush across town, he'd later told his parents that I'd seemed flustered and disorganized during dinner that evening. When he'd committed us to hosting his colleagues' families for a barbecue without telling me until the morning of the event, then criticized my frantic preparation efforts, he'd been building a case that I couldn't handle social obligations competently. When he'd scheduled business trips during Emma's doctor appointments, forcing me to manage medical consultations alone while juggling work deadlines, he'd noted my inability to balance priorities effectively. Most sickeningly, Jensen had been recording some of our private conversations, capturing moments when I'd express doubts about my parenting or worry about the children's needs. My vulnerable admissions about feeling overwhelmed by the demands of managing everything alone had been preserved as evidence that I was unfit for custody. But his cruelest manipulation involved the children themselves. Jensen had been subtly undermining my authority with Harry and Emma, encouraging them to come to him with problems instead of me, then documenting instances where they seemed to prefer Daddy as evidence of my inadequate mothering. He'd been positioning himself as the stable parent while systematically sabotaging my relationship with my own children. The financial planning was equally calculated. Jensen's separate investment account wasn't just hidden, it was structured to become inaccessible to me even after divorce proceedings began. He'd consulted with attorneys about asset protection strategies, ways to minimize alimony payments, and methods for claiming that I'd contributed less to our family's financial success than documentation would suggest. Most revealing were his communications with Camilla about their future together. Jensen had promised her that once the babysitter situation was resolved, they could have the family life she wanted, possibly including children of their own, without the complications of his previous arrangements. He'd described Harry and Emma as temporary responsibilities that would be minimized through custody agreements and boarding school placements. Camilla had responded enthusiastically to these plans, offering suggestions for how to make the transition as smooth as possible. She'd researched divorce attorneys known for aggressive tactics, identified family counselors who might support Jensen's custody claims, and even suggested specific language for documenting my supposed shortcomings as a parent. The two of them had been planning my destruction with the same attention to detail that most couples bring to wedding arrangements. They'd discuss timelines, backup strategies, potential obstacles, and celebration plans for when their scheme succeeded. Reading their messages felt like discovering that I'd been living with enemy agents who'd been gathering intelligence for a coordinated attack. But perhaps most infuriating was their casual dismissal of the harm their plan would cause Harry and Emma. Jensen had reassured Camilla that children adjust quickly to new situations and that his kids would probably prefer the stability of a new family arrangement once they got used to it. They'd discussed the children's emotional needs with the same detachment someone might use to plan the disposition of household furniture. The timeline Jensen had created showed that I had perhaps 2 months before he initiated divorce proceedings. His strategy required careful timing to coordinate with Arlington Construction's quarterly board meetings, ensuring that his personal life appeared stable when succession decisions were being made. He'd been planning to present his divorce as evidence of mature decision-making rather than the result of infidelity. Every detail had been calculated for maximum damage to me and minimum consequences for him. Jensen had been building a case that would leave me financially devastated, socially isolated, and separated from my children, while positioning himself as a responsible father who'd made difficult but necessary decisions for everyone's welfare. The depth of his deception was staggering, but it also revealed the scope of his vulnerability. Jensen had documented his own systematic fraud, emotional abuse, and child manipulation in detailed digital records. He'd created a comprehensive case against himself while believing he was building evidence against me. His greatest mistake was underestimating the very person he'd been planning to destroy. While Jensen was busy documenting my supposed failures, I'd been quietly gathering evidence of his actual crimes. His scheme required my continued ignorance and compliance, but I was neither ignorant nor compliant anymore. The predator was about to discover that his intended victim had been watching, learning, and preparing her own timeline for justice. My systematic evidence gathering began the morning after I discovered Jensen's 3-phase plan to destroy my life. If he wanted to build a case based on documentation, I would show him what real documentation looked like when compiled by someone who actually understood legal standards and evidentiary requirements. The first priority was securing Jensen's digital communications before he realized his laptop had been compromised. Using recovery software I'd learned about during my corporate law days, I created complete backups of his email accounts, text messages, and social media activity going back 18 months. Every conversation with Camilla, every message to divorce attorneys, every search query about custody laws and asset protection, all of it was copied to encrypted drives that I stored in a safety deposit box under my maiden name. But digital evidence was only part of the story.
Jensen's fraudulent business practices required physical documentation that he couldn't delete or deny. I began photographing every financial document that came through our house: credit card statements showing personal charges to business accounts, hotel receipts that contradicted his reported travel destinations, restaurant bills for romantic dinners that coincided with his supposed client meetings. The hardest part was maintaining my normal routine while conducting this investigation. Jensen couldn't suspect that I'd discovered his plan, or he might accelerate his timeline or destroy evidence before I could complete my case. So I continued playing the role of devoted wife and babysitter, preparing his meals, managing his schedule, and caring for our children, all while systematically documenting his betrayal. Ron's surveillance operation provided crucial external verification of Jensen's activities. My brother had been tracking Jensen's movements for 3 weeks, photographing his arrivals and departures from hotels, restaurants, and Camilla's apartment. The timestamps on these photos directly contradicted the alibis Jensen had given me about working late or attending business dinners. More importantly, Ron had captured images of Jensen and Camilla together in public settings where Jensen was known as a married family man. Photos of them kissing outside the country club where we held our membership, embracing in the parking lot of Harry's school during a parent-teacher conference night, holding hands at a restaurant frequented by Arlington construction clients. Each image represented potential witnesses who could testify about Jensen's public infidelity. Kate's legal expertise proved invaluable in understanding what types of evidence would be most damaging in family court proceedings. She explained that judges were particularly concerned with parental fitness issues, financial deception, and anything that suggested deliberate harm to children's welfare. Jensen's plan to manipulate Harry and Emma's loyalties while documenting my supposed inadequacies would backfire spectacularly once his true intentions were revealed. The custody recordings are actually perfect, Kate had explained during one of our confidential consultations. They show premeditation and systematic psychological manipulation. No judge wants to award custody to a parent who's been deliberately undermining the other parent's relationship with their children.
Arthur's corporate experience helped me understand the full scope of Jensen's business fraud and its potential consequences. Arlington Construction's moral conduct clauses weren't just about inheritance. They created personal liability for Jensen if his actions damaged the company's reputation or financial standing. His use of company resources for personal affairs could result in criminal charges for embezzlement and fraud. The beauty of this situation, Arthur had noted grimly, is that Jensen has created multiple overlapping cases against himself. The divorce fraud, the business embezzlement, the tax evasion through hidden accounts, each one reinforces the others. He's built a house of cards that will collapse completely once we start pulling threads. But the most crucial evidence came from Jensen himself, through conversations I began recording once I understood the scope of his deception. Using a small digital recorder I'd purchased with cash, I documented Jensen's continued lies about his whereabouts, his dismissive comments about parenting responsibilities, and his increasingly bold statements about our marriage being a temporary inconvenience. The recordings captured Jensen's true character in ways that written evidence couldn't convey. His tone when discussing Harry's learning needs, impatient and dismissive. His casual cruelty when describing me to friends who called the house just the nanny, basically. His calculating coldness when planning logistics for times when I'd be out of the picture. Most damning were the conversations where Jensen discussed his plans with people who didn't know about Camilla. He'd told his golf partner that he was considering simplifying his domestic situation once his kids were old enough for boarding school. He'd mentioned to a business associate that marriage wasn't really working for him anymore, and that he was exploring alternative arrangements. These statements proved that Jensen's deception wasn't limited to his affair. He'd been systematically lying to his entire social and professional network about his intentions regarding our family. The pattern of dishonesty extended far beyond infidelity into comprehensive fraud that touched every aspect of his life. The financial documentation was particularly revealing. Jensen's hidden investment account wasn't just stealing from our family, it represented tax fraud that could result in criminal penalties.
He'd been moving money through accounts that weren't reported on our joint tax returns, creating liability that could affect me even after divorce proceedings began. More concerning were the debts Jensen had been hiding. His gambling losses at the casino, his overspending on gifts for Camilla, his poor investment decisions, all of it was creating financial obligations that he intended to leave behind when he abandoned our marriage. The $60,000 he'd moved to his separate account didn't even cover the debts he'd accumulated through his reckless spending. By the third week of documentation, I had assembled a case that went far beyond typical divorce proceedings. Jensen hadn't just been unfaithful, he'd been systematically defrauding our family, his employer, and the tax authorities, while planning to abandon his children and destroy my reputation. Through false custody claims. The evidence filled 3 large binders, dozens of digital files, and a detailed timeline that showed the progression of Jensen's increasingly criminal behavior. Every phone call, every financial transaction, every lie he'd told was documented with dates, times, and supporting evidence that would be impossible to deny or explain away. But perhaps most importantly, I documented Jensen's own words describing his intentions. His recorded statements about viewing me as temporary help, his dismissive comments about our children's needs, his explicit plans to abandon his family responsibilities, all of it was captured in his own voice, making denial impossible. The evidence was comprehensive, verifiable, and devastating. Jensen had spent months building a case against me based on manufactured instances and manipulated circumstances. In response, I'd built a case against him based on his actual crimes, documented with the kind of thoroughness that comes from professional legal training and personal motivation for justice. The hunter had become the hunted, and the trap was about to close. The hardest part of my investigation wasn't gathering evidence or maintaining my cover. It was watching Jensen's manipulation affect Harry and Emma while knowing I couldn't intervene without jeopardizing my case. Every day brought new examples of how his systematic deception was damaging our children's emotional security and their relationship with me.
Harry, at 6 years old, had begun asking why Daddy seemed happier when Mommy wasn't around. Jensen had been scheduling special father-son activities during times when I had work commitments, then making comments about how peaceful their time together was compared to the chaos when the whole family was together. My son was internalizing the message that his mother's presence created problems rather than joy. Emma, still a toddler, couldn't articulate what she was sensing, but her behavior showed the impact of Jensen's psychological games. She'd started having more frequent tantrums, particularly when I tried to maintain routines that Jensen had begun undermining. When I'd put her to bed at her regular time, she'd cry for Daddy's way, referring to Jensen's recent habit of letting her stay up late as a special treat that made me look rigid and controlling by comparison. The most heartbreaking moments came during family dinners, when Jensen would subtly criticize my parenting choices in front of the children. If I reminded Harry to use his napkin, Jensen would say, "Your mom's really focused on table manners tonight," in a tone that suggested I was being unnecessarily strict. If I tried to limit Emma's dessert portions, he'd stage whisper, "Mommy's worried about sugar again," making me appear anxious and controlling. These comments seemed minor in isolation, but their cumulative effect was devastating. Jensen was systematically teaching our children that their mother was the source of rules, restrictions, and worries, while positioning himself as the fun parent who understood their needs better. Every interaction was calculated to build his custody case while eroding my relationship with Harry and Emma. But I couldn't defend myself without revealing that I knew about his plan. If I confronted Jensen about his manipulation tactics, he might accelerate his timeline or become more careful about hiding evidence. The case I was building required patience and strategic thinking, but maintaining that patience meant watching my children's trust in me gradually deteriorate. The custody recordings Jensen was making captured my most vulnerable moments as a mother, times when I was exhausted, frustrated, or worried about the children's needs. But what he couldn't record was the context that explained those emotions. My exhaustion came from managing everything alone while he pursued his affair. My frustration stemmed from his deliberate sabotage of family routines.
My worry reflected genuine concern for children whose father was planning to abandon them for a fantasy life with his mistress. Kate had warned me that family court judges often struggled to understand the difference between normal parental stress and genuine unfitness for custody. Jensen's recordings, taken out of context, could make me appear unstable, even though my responses were entirely reasonable given the circumstances I was actually facing. The key, Kate had explained, is showing the pattern of manipulation behind those moments. We need evidence that Jensen was deliberately creating stress, then documenting your reactions to that stress. The recordings actually help us once we can prove his premeditation. This knowledge didn't make it easier to watch my children absorb Jensen's subtle messages about their mother being inadequate. Harry had started coming to Jensen first when he had problems, having learned that Daddy was more understanding about things like forgotten homework or broken toys. Emma had begun pushing boundaries with me while being perfectly compliant with Jensen, responding to his consistent undermining of my authority. The psychological toll of maintaining my investigation while protecting my children was enormous. I had to document Jensen's emotional abuse while pretending not to notice it. I had to record his lies while acting as though I believed them. I had to gather evidence of his plan to abandon our family while continuing to care for him as a devoted wife. Sleep became elusive as I processed the day's discoveries and planned the next phase of evidence gathering. I'd lie awake listening to Jensen's breathing, knowing that the man beside me was planning my destruction. The intimacy of marriage had become a cruel charade where every kiss was contaminated by knowledge of his betrayal and every conversation was potential evidence of his deception. But perhaps most painful was realizing how thoroughly Jensen had convinced himself that his actions were justified. In his recorded conversations with Camilla, he genuinely seemed to believe that he was the victim of a marriage that had become inconvenient, rather than the perpetrator of systematic fraud and emotional abuse. He'd rewritten our history so completely that he appeared to have forgotten the reality of our relationship entirely.
The children sensed the tension even though I tried to shield them from the worst of it. Harry had started having nightmares about his family going away, while Emma became clingy during bedtime routines, as if she sensed that her security was threatened in ways she couldn't understand. They were experiencing the psychological impact of Jensen's manipulation without having the cognitive ability to process what was happening to them. Every day of continued investigation meant another day of allowing this damage to accumulate, but rushing to confront Jensen before building an airtight case could result in losing custody entirely, which would subject Harry and Emma to even more manipulation without my protection. The strategic choice was clear, but the emotional cost was almost unbearable. I found myself taking photographs of normal family moments, Harry reading bedtime stories to Emma, the children playing together in the backyard, quiet conversations over breakfast, as evidence of the life Jensen was planning to destroy. These images weren't just memories, they were documentation of what he was willing to sacrifice for his selfish fantasy. The weight of protecting everyone except myself was crushing, but it was also clarifying. This wasn't just about divorce or infidelity anymore. It was about preventing a manipulative person from gaining custody of vulnerable children who couldn't protect themselves from his psychological games. Jensen had made a critical miscalculation in targeting not just me, but Harry and Emma. His plan to manipulate our children's emotions for his own benefit had transformed my heartbreak into something much more powerful, a mother's protective fury focused with professional precision on ensuring justice for the people she loved most. The evidence gathering was almost complete, and soon I'd be able to stop documenting Jensen's crimes and start exposing them. The children's ordeal was about to end, even if they didn't yet understand that their mother had been fighting for them all along. The quarterly Arlington family barbecue was scheduled for the third Saturday in October, exactly 3 weeks after I'd discovered Jensen's plan to destroy our family. This annual gathering would provide the perfect stage for my revelation, with all the key players assembled in one location where Jensen couldn't control the narrative or escape the consequences.
Clay Arlington hosted these events at the family estate, a sprawling property that had been in the Arlington family for 3 generations. Every significant business decision, family announcement, and social milestone was traditionally shared at these gatherings. Jensen's promotion had been celebrated here. Our engagement had been announced here. Harry's birth had been toasted here. It was fitting that Jensen's downfall would also occur on this same stage. The guest list included everyone whose opinion mattered to Jensen's professional and personal future. Arlington Construction's board members and their families, key clients and business partners, extended family members who held positions in the company, and the social circle that defined Jensen's identity as a successful executive and devoted family man. Most importantly, Camilla Ford would be attending as the guest of another board member, having no idea that she was walking into a carefully orchestrated trap. My preparations required coordination across multiple moving parts, each timed to maximize impact while minimizing opportunities for Jensen to contain the damage. Arthur had prepared legal documents that would be served simultaneously with my public revelation, ensuring that Jensen couldn't manipulate the narrative or destroy evidence once his crimes were exposed. Kate had arranged for Child Protective Services to be notified about the custody manipulation, triggering an investigation that would prevent Jensen from using his documented lies against me in court. Ron's surveillance team would be positioned throughout the event, capturing reactions and documenting any attempts by Jensen or Camilla to coordinate their responses once the truth was revealed. Every conversation, every exit attempt, every moment of panic would be preserved as evidence of their consciousness of guilt. The manila envelope I'd be presenting to Camilla contained copies of our marriage certificate, joint tax returns from the past 5 years, insurance policies listing me as Jensen's spouse and beneficiary, and documentation of our joint ownership of assets that Jensen had told her belonged solely to him. These weren't just proof of our legal relationship. They were evidence that everything Jensen had told Camilla about his single status was a deliberate lie.
But the envelope would also contain something Camilla wasn't expecting: documentation of her own legal liability as a knowing participant in Jensen's fraud. Her text messages discussing strategies for removing the babysitter and researching divorce attorneys to help Jensen fabricate custody claims made her a co-conspirator in systematic fraud. Her enthusiastic participation in planning my destruction would become evidence against her in criminal proceedings. The timing had to be perfect. I'd arranged for the revelation to occur during the traditional family toast, when everyone would be assembled in the main garden with drinks in hand and nowhere to escape without causing a scene. Jensen would be expected to make remarks about family values and business success, the same themes that would make his exposure maximally humiliating. Clay Arlington's presence was crucial to the plan's effectiveness. Jensen's father needed to witness his son's moral collapse firsthand, in front of the business associates and family members whose respect Jensen desperately craved. The company's moral conduct clauses could only be triggered by board action, and Clay would need to see undeniable evidence of Jensen's betrayal before making decisions about succession and inheritance. Faith Arlington's reaction would be equally important. Jensen's mother had always prided herself on raising sons with strong moral character and family values. Her public humiliation at discovering Jensen's systematic deception would eliminate any possibility of family protection or financial support during his legal troubles. The children's welfare remained my primary concern throughout these preparations. Harry and Emma would be present at the barbecue, as they always were, but I'd arranged for my sister Amelia to be ready to remove them from the situation once the revelation began. They didn't need to witness their father's exposure, and their absence would prevent Jensen from using their emotional distress as a manipulation tactic. Kate had explained that family court judges viewed parental behavior during crisis situations as particularly revealing of character. Jensen's response to being exposed, whether he showed concern for his children's well-being or focused primarily on managing his own damage, would become part of the custody evaluation that would determine Harry and Emma's future living arrangements. The media strategy was also carefully planned.
Arlington's construction's reputation in the community meant that Jensen's exposure would likely attract local news coverage. Arthur had prepared statements that would frame the revelation in terms of protecting children and exposing financial crimes rather than personal vindication. The narrative needed to focus on justice rather than revenge, accountability rather than retaliation. Most crucially, I'd prepared contingency plans for every possible response Jensen might attempt. If he tried to deny the evidence, I had witnesses and documentation that would corroborate every claim. If he attempted to blame me for the marriage's problems, I had recordings of his own statements about viewing me as temporary help. If he claimed that his business practices were standard or legal, I had expert testimony about fraud and embezzlement that would contradict his explanations. Camilla's reaction was harder to predict, but I'd prepared for various scenarios there as well. If she claimed ignorance about Jensen's married status, I had text messages showing her detailed knowledge of our family situation. If she tried to present herself as another victim of Jensen's deception, I had evidence of her enthusiastic participation in planning my destruction. If she attempted to leave before facing consequences, Ron's team would document her flight as evidence of consciousness of guilt. The psychological preparation was perhaps the most challenging aspect of planning Jensen's exposure. For weeks, I'd been maintaining the facade of devoted wife and mother while knowing exactly how I intended to destroy that image publicly. The emotional compartmentalization required to plan someone's downfall while continuing to care for them intimately was exhausting and surreal. But the children's safety provided clarity that cut through any doubts about my chosen course of action. Jensen's plan to manipulate Harry and Emma's emotions for custody advantage had crossed a line that eliminated my willingness to consider reconciliation or private resolution. His crimes against our family required public accountability and legal consequences that would protect not just me, but any future families he might deceive. The trap was set, the evidence was assembled, and the stage was prepared. Jensen Arlington was about to discover that dismissing someone as just the babysitter doesn't eliminate their power, it just makes them invisible until they choose to be seen. And I was ready to be seen by everyone who mattered.
The morning of the barbecue dawned clear and crisp, perfect weather for what would become the most significant day in Jensen Arlington's life, though he had no idea that his carefully constructed world was about to collapse. I watched him get dressed with particular attention to his appearance, choosing the navy blazer his mother had given him for his promotion, adjusting his tie with the confidence of a man who believed he controlled every aspect of his narrative. "You seem excited about today," I commented, helping Emma into her favorite dress while Harry practiced tying his shoes nearby. The normalcy of our family morning routine felt surreal given what I knew was coming. "Just looking forward to celebrating with the family," Jensen replied, checking his phone for what I knew were messages from Camilla confirming her arrival time and their plan to maintain appropriate distance during the event. "Dad's been talking about some big announcements. Could be good news for the company." His casual mention of big announcements would prove prophetic in ways he couldn't imagine. Clay Arlington did indeed have significant news to share, but Jensen's exposure would overshadow whatever business developments his father had planned to discuss. The drive to the Arlington estate gave me time to review my mental checklist one final time. Arthur's legal documents were prepared and ready for immediate service. Kate's coordination with Child Protective Services was confirmed. Ron's surveillance team was already positioned around the property. The manila envelope containing Camilla's devastating surprise was secured in my purse, along with backup copies of the most critical evidence. Emma chattered happily from her car seat about seeing her grandparents, while Harry asked questions about the games that would be available at the party. Their innocent excitement made my heart ache, knowing that their father's actions would forever change their understanding of family security. But protecting them from Jensen's manipulation required this public accountability, regardless of the short-term disruption it would cause. Jensen's phone buzzed constantly during the drive, final coordination messages with Camilla about their careful choreography for the day. They'd planned to arrive separately, maintain minimal interaction, and avoid any behavior that might suggest their relationship to observant family members. The irony was perfect. All their careful planning to avoid detection had been rendered meaningless by evidence I'd been gathering for weeks. The Arlington estate looked magnificent, as it always did for these gatherings. Clay had spared no expense in creating an atmosphere of family tradition and business success. Elegant tents were positioned throughout the gardens, catering stations offered gourmet selections, and a string quartet provided sophisticated background music. The setting suggested stability, prosperity, and moral integrity, everything Jensen was about to lose. Faith Arlington greeted us at the door with her usual warmth, embracing the children and complimenting my dress with genuine affection. "Alyssa dear, you look lovely as always. And Jensen so handsome in that blazer." Her pride in her son was evident, making what was coming even more devastating for the entire family. Clay's greeting was cordial but distracted. He was clearly focused on the business announcements he'd planned for later in the afternoon. "Jensen, good to see you. We'll need to talk after the toast." Some interesting developments with the Henderson project. His casual mention of needing to discuss business matters would soon be overshadowed by much more urgent family crises. As guests arrived and mingled throughout the gardens, I maintained my usual role as the supportive wife, making pleasant conversation and ensuring the children were entertained while quietly monitoring the positioning of key players. Board members clustered around Clay, discussing quarterly projections and upcoming contracts. Their wives formed social groups focused on charity events and family news. Everything proceeded according to decades of established tradition. Camilla's arrival created the first subtle shift in dynamics. She entered as the guest of board member Harrison Baker, Kate's father, who had no idea he was providing cover for his daughter's friend's legal strategy. Camilla looked stunning in a designer dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, her confidence radiating the assurance of someone who believed she was about to claim her rightful place in Jensen's public life.
I watched Jensen's reaction to seeing Camilla across the garden, the slight pause in conversation, the careful avoidance of direct eye contact, the strategic positioning that kept them on opposite sides of the main gathering area. Their practiced indifference to each other would have been convincing to casual observers, but I could read the subtle signals of two people fighting the urge to acknowledge their connection. The children played with their cousins, blissfully unaware that their lives were about to change forever. Emma's laughter carried across the garden as she chased after soap bubbles, while Harry engaged in serious discussions with his older cousin about the relative merits of different superhero powers. Their innocence provided stark contrast to the calculated deceptions being maintained by the adults around them. As the afternoon progressed toward the traditional toast time, I felt an unexpected calm settle over me. After weeks of maintaining facades and gathering evidence, the time for pretense was almost over. Soon, I would be able to stop protecting Jensen's reputation and start protecting my children's future. The weight of secrets and strategic planning would be replaced by the clarity of public truth. Jensen approached me during a quiet moment, his expression showing unusual warmth. "Thanks for being so great about today," he said, apparently interpreting my calm demeanor as contentment with our family situation. "I know these events aren't always your favorite, but it means a lot to have you here supporting the family." His genuine gratitude for my presence at the event where I planned to destroy him was almost unbearably ironic. "Of course," I replied steadily, "family is everything." The truth of that statement would be revealed shortly, though not in the way Jensen expected. Clay began gathering guests toward the main garden area where the traditional toast would occur. Board members and their families formed a loose circle around the speaking area, drinks in hand, faces expectant for whatever announcements their host had planned. Camilla positioned herself strategically where she could observe Jensen's reaction to his father's remarks, the perfect location for what was coming. The stage was set, the players were in position, and the time for revelation had arrived. Jensen stood confidently beside his father, ready to bask in whatever praise or recognition Clay intended to share. He had no idea that his babysitter was about to transform from invisible domestic help into the architect of his complete downfall.
The trap that had been weeks in the making was finally ready to spring. Clay Arlington raised his crystal champagne flute, the familiar gesture that had signaled important family announcements for decades. "Friends, family, colleagues," he began, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd built an empire through decades of hard work and ethical leadership. "Thank you all for joining us today to celebrate another successful quarter and to share some exciting news about Arlington Construction's future." Jensen straightened beside his father, his smile radiating confidence as he prepared for what he assumed would be recognition of his contributions to the company. The board members nodded approvingly, their wives smiled expectantly, and the general atmosphere suggested another routine celebration of Arlington family achievements. "Before I discuss our business developments," Clay continued, "I want to take a moment to acknowledge the foundation of everything we've built here: family values, integrity, and trust. These principles have guided Arlington Construction for 4 decades, and they will continue to guide us as we move forward." His words about integrity and trust would prove more significant than anyone realized. As Clay spoke about family values, I caught Camilla's eye across the garden and smiled warmly, raising my own champagne flute in what appeared to be a friendly acknowledgement. Her slight nod in response suggested she assumed I was simply being polite to another guest, having no idea that I knew exactly who she was and why she was there. However, Clay's tone shifted slightly, becoming more serious. "Recent events have reminded me that success means nothing without moral character, and that family businesses require family members who embody the principles we represent to our community." Jensen's confident expression flickered momentarily. Something in his father's tone suggested this wasn't going to be the straightforward celebration he'd expected. Around the garden, other family members exchanged glances, sensing an undercurrent they couldn't quite identify. This was my moment. I stepped forward slightly, moving from my position near the children toward the center of the gathering. "Clay, if I may," I said clearly, my voice carrying across the garden with the authority of someone who belonged in this family circle. "Before you make your announcements, there's something important that needs to be addressed." The crowd turned toward me with surprise. The quiet, supportive wife rarely spoke during these formal family gatherings. Jensen's face showed confusion mixed with the beginning of alarm. This wasn't part of any script he recognized, and my tone suggested something far more significant than typical social pleasantries. "Alyssa," Faith Arlington said warmly, "how lovely to hear from you, dear. What would you like to share?" I reached into my purse and withdrew the manila envelope that had been waiting for this moment. "Actually, I have something specific to share with one of our guests," I replied, my gaze settling directly on Camilla. "Something that I think everyone here should witness." Camilla's expression shifted from polite interest to wariness as she realized she was being singled out. Around the garden, conversations quieted as guests sensed that something unexpected was about to unfold. I walked directly toward Camilla, the envelope in my hands drawing every eye in the gathering. Jensen took a step forward, his face now showing clear panic as he realized his carefully maintained separation from his mistress was about to be shattered in the most public way possible. "Camilla Ford," I said clearly, ensuring everyone could hear her full name. "I believe we need to have a conversation about your relationship with my husband." The garden fell completely silent, except for the string quartet, who continued playing their elegant background music, unaware that they were now providing a surreal soundtrack to a family's destruction. Faith Arlington's champagne flute trembled slightly in her hand. Clay's expression showed dawning comprehension that something far more serious than business announcements was unfolding. Jensen's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, his worst nightmare beginning to materialize in front of everyone whose opinion mattered to his future. The careful choreography he and Camilla had planned to maintain their secret was crumbling as every eye in the gathering focused on the connection I just publicly acknowledged. Camilla's face had gone pale, but she lifted her chin with defiant composure. "I'm sorry, I think there's been some misunderstanding," she said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "I'm here as Harrison's guest, and I don't know what you're suggesting about." "About your 8-month affair with Jensen?" I interrupted smoothly. About your text messages planning to remove a babysitter from his life? About your research into divorce attorneys and boarding schools for his children? The gasps from the gathered families were audible now. Board members' wives clutched their husbands' arms. Clay Arlington's face had turned ashen. Faith had pressed her hand to her mouth in shock. But I wasn't finished. This was just the beginning of Camilla's education about exactly who she'd been sharing a bed with. You see, I continued, opening the envelope, there are some things about Jensen's situation that he apparently neglected to mention during your relationship. Jensen finally found his voice. Alyssa, stop this right now. You don't know what you're doing. I turned to face my husband directly, my expression calm and controlled. Actually, Jensen, I know exactly what I'm doing. The question is whether you want to explain to everyone here who I really am, or if you'd prefer that I do it myself. Jensen's face flushed red as he stepped closer, his voice dropping to what he thought was a private whisper, but was actually audible to half the gathering. You need to stop this embarrassing scene right now and get the children home. This is completely inappropriate behavior for a family event. His attempt to reassert control by treating me like misbehaving hired help was exactly the opening I'd hoped for. I smiled serenely and spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. Jensen, are you ordering me to leave your father's home? Are you telling me to take Harry and Emma away from their grandparents' party? Clay Arlington stepped forward, his expression showing growing alarm. What exactly is going on here? Jensen, who is this woman you're speaking to like an employee? His question revealed that he'd never quite understood my role in his son's life, a misunderstanding Jensen had apparently encouraged. Faith Arlington moved closer as well, her maternal instincts clearly troubled by her son's tone toward his wife. Jensen, dear, why are you speaking to Alyssa that way? She's family. Actually, Jensen said desperately, there's been some confusion about—
About what? I interrupted. About who I am? About my relationship to you? About my legal status in this family? I turned to address Clay directly. Mr. Arlington, your son has been telling people that I'm his babysitter, just the hired help who looks after Harry and Emma. Would you like to know what I actually am? The crowd pressed closer, sensing that whatever was unfolding went far deeper than a simple marital spat. Board members who'd known Jensen for years looked confused. They'd assumed I was his wife, but his behavior suggested something entirely different. Camilla, who had been standing frozen during this exchange, finally found her voice. I don't understand what's happening here. Jensen told me you were— What did he tell you I was? I asked her directly, pulling the first document from my envelope. Did he tell you I was temporary help? Someone who could be easily replaced when it was convenient? Jensen made a desperate grab for the envelope, but I stepped back smoothly. Don't, he hissed. You have no idea what you're destroying. I know exactly what I'm destroying, I replied. The question is whether you're going to continue lying to your family or whether you're going to tell them the truth about who I am and what you've been doing. Clay's voice cut through the tension with paternal authority. Enough, Jensen, I want a straight answer right now. Who is this woman? What is her relationship to you and to our grandchildren? The moment of truth had arrived. Jensen looked around the circle of expectant faces, his parents, his colleagues, his business associates, and the mistress he'd been hiding from all of them. Everyone was waiting for him to define my identity and role in his life. Jensen began, then stopped, realizing that every possible answer would destroy some aspect of his carefully constructed lies. If he acknowledged me as his wife, Camilla would discover his deception. If he maintained the babysitter story, his family would be appalled by his treatment of the mother of their grandchildren. I'm his wife, I said, clearly, ending his paralysis. I'm Mrs. Jensen Arlington. I've been married to your son for 8 years, during which time he's apparently been telling his mistress that I'm hired help who can be discarded when convenient. Faith Arlington's champagne flute shattered on the flagstone patio. Married?
she whispered. "Jensen, what is she talking about? Of course Alyssa is your wife. We were at your wedding. Harry and Emma are our grandchildren." Clay's face had gone from confusion to dawning horror as he began to understand the implications. "Jensen," he said slowly, "are you telling me that you've been having an affair while letting this woman believe your wife was just household staff?" Camilla's voice was barely audible. "Married? Jensen, you told me you weren't married. You said she was temporary childcare until you could make other arrangements." The web of lies was unraveling exactly as I'd planned. Each person Jensen had deceived was confronting him simultaneously, making it impossible for him to manage the narrative or contain the damage. "This is insane," Jensen said desperately. "Everyone just calm down. There's been a misunderstanding." "What misunderstanding?" I asked, pulling out our marriage certificate. "About this legal document? About the vows you took in front of your parents? About the children we had together?" I handed the certificate to Clay, who examined it with the careful attention of someone who understood legal documents. 8 years, Clay read aloud. "You've been married for 8 years." He looked up at his son with an expression of complete bewilderment. How could there be any misunderstanding about this? Jensen's authority, his control over the situation, and his carefully maintained image were crumbling simultaneously. The man who had dismissed me as just the babysitter was discovering that dismissing someone doesn't make their legal rights disappear. It just makes the eventual reckoning more spectacular. I reached into the envelope and withdrew a photograph. Our wedding photo from 8 years ago. The same image that had hung in Jensen's parents' home for years before mysteriously disappearing from their main hallway. I handed it directly to Camilla, whose face went ashen as she recognized Jensen in his formal wedding attire, standing beside me in my white gown. "This is who Jensen married," I said clearly. "Not a babysitter, not hire help, not someone he met after you started your relationship. His wife. The mother of his children, the woman whose signature is on every major financial document in his life." Camilla stared at the photograph, her hands trembling as the full scope of Jensen's deception became undeniable. "You told me you'd never been married," she whispered, looking at Jensen with growing horror. "You said you were single. You said she was just temporary childcare."
Faith Arlington had recovered enough to find her voice. "Camilla, dear, I don't understand what Jensen has told you, but Alyssa has been our daughter-in-law for 8 years. We celebrated their anniversary just last month. Harry and Emma call us Grandma and Grandpa." I pulled out our joint tax returns, insurance policies, and bank account statements, spreading them across the nearest patio table where everyone could see the documentation of our legal marriage. 8 years of joint finances, I explained. Shared assets, shared debts, shared legal responsibility for everything Jensen has done during our marriage. Clay Arlington examined the documents with the practiced eye of a businessman who understood financial structures. "These are all recent," he said grimly. "Joint accounts, shared liability, legal marriage in every financial sense." He looked up at Jensen with an expression of dawning comprehension. "Son, what have you been telling this woman about your family situation?" Jensen was trapped between his parents' confusion and Camilla's growing fury. Any attempt to explain would reveal the depth of his deception to one audience or the other. "I can explain everything," he said desperately. "There are complications you don't understand." "What complications?" I asked. "The complication where you told Camilla that Harry and Emma would be going to boarding school so they wouldn't interfere with your new life together? The complication where you promised her you'd resolve the childcare situation once you'd gotten rid of the temporary help?" Camilla dropped the wedding photograph as if it had burned her fingers. "You said they were just kids you were helping with until their real parents could take care of them. You said it was a temporary arrangement through your company's charity program." The gasps from the gathered family members were audible. Faith Arlington pressed her hand to her chest as if she couldn't breathe. "Charity program?
Jensen, you told this woman that your own children were charity cases? Clay's expression had moved beyond confusion into something approaching rage. You've been lying to everyone, he said slowly. To this woman about being married, to us about your intentions, to your wife about your relationship. How long has this been going on? I pulled out printed copies of text messages between Jensen and Camilla, the dates clearly visible. 8 months, I said calmly. 8 months of systematic deception where Jensen convinced his mistress that his wife was hired help and convinced his wife that his frequent absences were work-related. Board member Harrison Baker, who had brought Camilla as his guest, looked mortified as he realized he'd been unknowingly providing cover for an affair. Camilla, I had no idea. You told me you were dating someone, but you never mentioned he was married. Because I didn't know he was married, Camilla snapped, her composure finally cracking. He lied to me about everything. He said he was single, successful, ready to start a real relationship. He never mentioned a wife or that those children were his own. Faith Arlington moved toward me with tears in her eyes. Alyssa, dear, I'm so sorry. I don't understand how this happened, but you're our family. You've always been our family. Her genuine distress at discovering Jensen's betrayal was touching, but I had more revelations to share. There's something else everyone needs to know, I said, pulling out financial documents that showed Jensen's hidden accounts and fraudulent business expenses. The affair isn't the only way Jensen has been deceiving people. Clay's attention sharpened immediately. As the head of Arlington Construction, any suggestion of financial impropriety would threaten the company's reputation and potentially its survival. What are you talking about? I spry out copies of credit card statements, expense reports, and hotel receipts across the table. Jensen has been using Arlington Construction funds to pay for his affair. Hotel rooms charged to company accounts for personal meetings, restaurant bills submitted as client entertainment when he was actually dining with Camilla. The board members pressed closer to examine the documents, their expressions growing increasingly grim as they recognized company account numbers and expense categories. Jensen's fraudulent spending was documented in clear detail, showing a pattern of systematic theft from the family business. This represents thousands of dollars in fraudulent expenses, I continued, money stolen from Arlington Construction to fund Jensen's deception of his family and his mistress. Clay's attention sharpened immediately. As the head of Arlington Construction, any suggestion of financial impropriety would threaten the company's reputation and potentially its survival. What are you talking about? I spread out copies of credit card statements, expense reports, and hotel receipts across the table. Jensen has been using Arlington Construction funds to pay for his affair. Hotel rooms charged to company accounts for personal meetings, restaurant bills submitted as client entertainment when he was actually dining with Camilla. The board members pressed closer to examine the documents, their expressions growing increasingly grim as they recognized company account numbers and expense categories. Jensen's fraudulent spending was documented in clear detail, showing a pattern of systematic theft from the family business. This represents thousands of dollars in fraudulent expenses, I continued, money stolen from Arlington Construction to fund Jensen's deception of his family and his mistress.
Clay's face had gone white as he calculated the potential legal and financial ramifications. Embezzlement, he said quietly. Corporate fraud. Breach of fiduciary duty. He looked at his son with an expression of complete devastation. You've stolen from the company. You've lied to your family. You've betrayed everyone who trusted you. Jensen's carefully constructed world was collapsing completely. His reputation, his career, his family relationships, and his romantic fantasy were all crumbling simultaneously in front of the people whose respect he'd most wanted to maintain. The babysitter he'd dismissed had just revealed herself to be his legal wife, the architect of his downfall, and the person who held the evidence to destroy everything he'd built his identity around. Arthur Tanner appeared at the edge of the gathering as if summoned by the chaos, his briefcase in hand and his expression grimly professional. "Mr. Arlington," he said, addressing Clay directly,
I'm Arthur Tanner from Tanner and Associates. Mrs. Arlington retained our services to investigate certain irregularities in your son's conduct. Clay looked from Arthur to me with dawning understanding. You hired attorneys? How long have you known about this? 3 weeks, I replied calmly. 3 weeks since I discovered Jensen's plan to destroy our marriage through fraudulent custody claims while stealing from your company to fund his affair. I nodded to Arthur, who opened his briefcase and withdrew additional documents. The financial fraud extends beyond simple expense account abuse, Arthur explained, spreading out bank statements and investment records. Mr. Jensen Arlington has been systematically diverting family assets into hidden accounts while accumulating significant debts that create liability for both his wife and Arlington Construction. Camilla, who had been standing in stunned silence, suddenly found her voice. Hidden accounts? Jensen, you told me you were wealthy. You said you owned property and investments worth millions. I pulled out copies of our actual financial statements, including mortgage payments and credit card debts that told a very different story. Jensen has been living far beyond our means while hiding the debt from both his family and his mistress. The luxury lifestyle he's been showing you, Camilla, was funded through company embezzlement and credit fraud. Clay examined the documents with the focused attention of someone whose business empire was suddenly at risk. These charges, Jensen, you've been stealing from petty cash, inflating expense reports, and using company credit for personal purchases. This isn't just unethical, it's criminal. Faith Arlington had been quietly weeping, but she looked up with sudden clarity. The missing funds from the charity auction. Jensen, you were in charge of depositing those proceeds. Did you... $23,000, I confirmed, producing bank records that showed the charity funds deposited into Jensen's hidden personal account rather than the designated charitable organization. Money donated by your friends and business associates to help disadvantaged children was stolen to pay for Jensen's affair. The board members exchanged horrified glances as they calculated the potential legal and reputational damage. Embezzling charity funds was not only criminal, but would destroy Arlington Construction's standing in the community once the news became public. Jensen finally attempted to defend himself. This is all being taken out of context. The money was temporary borrowing that I intended to repay. The relationship issues are private family matters that don't concern the business. Actually, Arthur interjected, the business concerns are extensive. Your personal conduct has created massive liability for Arlington Construction through fraudulent expense reports, theft of company funds, and misappropriation of charitable donations. The company faces potential criminal investigation and civil lawsuits. I reached into the envelope for the final revelation, printed copies of Jensen's text messages detailing his plan to manipulate custody proceedings through false documentation of my parental fitness. But perhaps most damaging of all is evidence that Jensen has been systematically plotting to gain custody of Harry and Emma through fraudulent claims about my mental stability. Faith Arlington gasped audibly. Custody? Jensen, what is she talking about? I handed her copies of Jensen's messages to Camilla discussing strategies for documenting my supposed inadequacies as a mother. Your son has been deliberately creating stressful situations, then recording my responses as evidence that I'm unfit for custody. He's been planning to take my children away from me based on manufactured evidence.
Clay's expression had moved beyond anger into something approaching devastation. You've been manipulating your own children? Using them as weapons in some scheme to abandon your family? The text messages were clear and damning. Jensen's own words described his plan to undermine my relationship with Harry and Emma while building a false case for his superior parenting. His casual discussion of sending the children to boarding school once custody was secured showed his true priorities. Camilla read over Faith's shoulder, her face growing pale as she realized the full scope of Jensen's manipulation. You were planning to send them away? Jensen, you told me you loved those children. You said they were important to you. They were obstacles, I said quietly.
allowing Jensen's own recorded words to speak for themselves. Temporary inconveniences to be managed until they could be removed from your new life together. The assembled families stared at Jensen with expressions of complete revulsion. Board members who had respected him professionally now saw him as someone who would manipulate his own children for personal gain. Parents who had trusted him with their business decisions realized he was capable of systematic deception and emotional abuse. Arthur cleared his throat professionally. Given the evidence of criminal fraud, child endangerment through emotional manipulation, and breach of fiduciary duty to Arlington Construction, we'll be filing criminal complaints with the district attorney's office tomorrow morning. Jensen's face had gone completely white as the full consequences of his exposure became clear. Criminal charges, civil lawsuits, loss of family support, destruction of his professional reputation, and the end of his relationship with Camilla, everything was collapsing simultaneously. The man who had reduced me to just the babysitter was discovering that his wife possessed the legal expertise, professional connections, and strategic thinking necessary to dismantle his life as methodically as he had planned to destroy hers. Within minutes of Arthur's announcement about criminal charges, Clay Arlington moved into crisis management mode. "All board members, we need an emergency meeting immediately," he announced grimly. "Jensen, you're suspended from all company duties effective immediately pending investigation." Faith Arlington collapsed into a nearby chair, the full weight of her son's betrayal finally hitting her. "How could you do this to your own family?" she whispered, looking at Jensen as if she'd never seen him before. "Those precious children, your wife who's done nothing but support you? How could you plan such cruelty?" Jensen's attempt at damage control was pathetic. "Mom, you don't understand the pressure I've been under, the company expectations, the financial stress." "Financial stress you created by stealing from us," Clay interrupted, his voice thundering across the garden. "You've betrayed every principle this family stands for. You've endangered the company our grandfather built." Camilla had been standing frozen during this exchange, but suddenly she exploded with fury. "You lied to me about everything! Your marital status, your children, your finances, everything!" She turned to me with tears in her eyes. "I am so sorry. I had no idea he was married. I would never have gotten involved with someone's husband." Her genuine distress was actually touching, despite everything. "I believe you," I said quietly. "You were as much a victim of his deception as I was. The difference is that you can walk away from him right now." And walk away she did. Without another word to Jensen, Camilla gathered her purse and headed toward the estate's exit, her high heels clicking decisively on the flagstone path. Jensen called after her desperately, but she never looked back. Board members were already pulling out their phones, calling attorneys and crisis management specialists. The damage to Arlington Construction's reputation would be severe, and they needed to distance the company from Jensen's crimes as quickly as possible. Harry and Emma had been playing in a distant part of the garden during the confrontation, but now they approached tentatively, sensing that something significant had happened. My sister Amelia appeared beside them, having been waiting in the background as planned. "Mommy, why is everyone upset?" Harry asked, looking between his father's pale face and his grandmother's tears. "Sometimes adults make very bad choices," I told him gently, kneeling to his level. "But no matter what happens, you and Emma are safe and loved." Clay Arlington looked at his son with complete disgust. "Pack your things and leave the family property. Your mother and I need time to decide whether we can ever forgive what you've done to this family." Jensen's final plea was directed at me. "Alyssa, please, we can work this out privately. Think about the children." "I am thinking about the children," I replied calmly. "I'm protecting them from a father who was planning to abandon them once it became convenient." Arthur approached with legal documents. "Jensen Arlington, you're being served with divorce papers, restraining orders, and notice of criminal complaints being filed tomorrow." As Jensen stood there clutching the papers that would destroy his life, I felt an unexpected sense of peace. The battle was over. Justice was served, And my children would grow up knowing that their mother had protected them when it mattered most. The babysitter had just shown everyone exactly what she was capable of when she stopped being invisible. 6 weeks later, I stood in the kitchen of what was now officially my house, watching Harry help Emma stack blocks while they waited for breakfast. The divorce had been finalized with remarkable speed once Jensen's criminal charges made headlines. His attorney had advised him to accept my terms rather than fight a custody battle he couldn't possibly win. Faith and Clay Arlington visited regularly, their relationship with me stronger than it had ever been with their son. "We failed him somehow," Faith had said during one of our conversations, "but we won't fail you or the children." They'd ensured that Harry and Emma's college funds were protected from Jensen's financial disasters, and Clay had personally apologized for not recognizing the signs of his son's deception earlier. "You were protecting this family while we were blind to what was happening," he'd told me. "We owe you a debt we can never repay." Kate had taken on my divorce case pro bono, ensuring that I received full custody and the majority of our marital assets. Jensen's criminal conviction made the financial settlement straightforward. Criminals don't get to keep the proceeds of their crimes. "The beauty of this case," Kate had explained, "is that Jensen documented everything himself. His text messages, his financial records, his manipulation schemes. He built the entire case against himself." Ron's surveillance evidence had been crucial in the criminal proceedings. Jensen was sentenced to 18 months in prison for embezzlement and fraud, followed by 3 years of probation. The charity funds were returned with interest, but the damage to his reputation was permanent. Arthur had helped me restart my consulting practice, connecting me with corporate clients who needed someone with my specific combination of legal expertise and investigative skills. The irony wasn't lost on me that Jensen's betrayal had ultimately freed me to pursue the career I'd put aside for our marriage. Emma looked up from her blocks and grinned at me. "Mama, play blocks." "In just a minute, sweetheart," I replied, finishing their breakfast preparations. The children had adjusted remarkably well to Jensen's absence, perhaps because his manipulation had already created emotional distance between them. Harry occasionally asked about his father, and I answered his questions honestly but age-appropriately. "Daddy made some very bad choices that hurt our family, so he has to live somewhere else now." The therapeutic support we'd arranged was helping both children process the changes. My phone buzzed with a text from Camilla. We'd maintained occasional contact after the revelation, both of us recognizing that we'd been victims of the same man's deceptions. She'd moved across the country for a fresh start, but she'd sent a card on Emma's birthday with a simple note, "Thank you for saving us both." The morning routine felt peaceful in a way that our family life had never achieved when Jensen was undermining it from within. No more walking on eggshells around his moods, no more wondering why he seemed distant, no more managing his schedule while he planned my destruction. "Blocks now, Mama," Emma insisted, and I abandoned the breakfast dishes to join my children on the living room floor. This is what Jensen had been planning to sacrifice for his fantasy life with Camilla, these ordinary moments of connection and joy with the people who loved him most. He'd reduced me to just the babysitter, never realizing that being the person who cared for his children was actually the most powerful position in his life. When he'd dismissed me as hired help, he'd forgotten that I was the one his children trusted, the one who knew their needs, the one who would fight for their future. The man who thought he could rewrite our family's story had learned that the person taking care of his children was also the one who would decide how that story ended. 1 year later, I received an unexpected visitor at my consulting office. Clay Arlington stood in my reception area, holding an envelope with the familiar Arlington construction letterhead. Clay's face had gone white as he calculated the potential legal and financial ramifications. "Embezzlement," he said quietly. "Corporate fraud. Breach of fiduciary duty." He looked at his son with an expression of complete devastation. "You've stolen from the company. You've lied to your family. You've betrayed everyone who trusted you." Jensen's carefully constructed world was collapsing completely. His reputation, his career, his family relationships, and his romantic fantasy were all crumbling simultaneously in front of the people whose respect he'd most wanted to maintain. The babysitter he'd dismissed had just revealed herself to be his legal wife, the architect of his downfall, and the person who held the evidence to destroy everything he'd built his identity around. Arthur Tanner appeared at the edge of the gathering as if summoned by the chaos, his briefcase in hand and his expression grimly professional. "Mr. Arlington," he said, addressing Clay directly, "I'm Arthur Tanner from Tanner & Associates. Mrs. Arlington retained our services to investigate certain irregularities in your son's conduct." Clay looked from Arthur to me with dawning understanding. "You hired attorneys? How long have you known about this?" 3 weeks, I replied calmly. 3 weeks since I discovered Jensen's plan to destroy our marriage through fraudulent custody claims while stealing from your company to fund his affair. I nodded to Arthur, who opened his briefcase and withdrew additional documents. "The financial fraud extends beyond simple expense account abuse," Arthur explained, spreading out bank statements and investment records. "Mr. Jensen Arlington has been systematically diverting family assets into hidden accounts while accumulating significant debts that create liability for both his wife and Arlington Construction." Camilla, who had been standing in stunned silence, suddenly found her voice. "Hidden accounts? Jensen, you told me you were wealthy. You said you owned property and investments worth millions." I pulled out copies of our actual financial statements, including mortgage payments and credit card debts that told a very different story. Jensen has been living far beyond our means while hiding the debt from both his family and his mistress. The luxury lifestyle he's been showing you, Camilla, was funded through company embezzlement and credit fraud. Clay examined the documents with the focused attention of someone whose business empire was suddenly at risk. "These charges, Jensen, you've been stealing from petty cash, inflating expense reports, and using company credit for personal purchases. This isn't just unethical, it's criminal." Faith Arlington had been quietly weeping, but she looked up with sudden clarity. "The missing funds from the charity auction. Jensen, you were in charge of depositing those proceeds. Did you—" $23,000, I confirmed, producing bank records that showed the charity funds deposited into Jensen's hidden personal account rather than the designated charitable organization. Money donated by your friends and business associates to help disadvantaged children was stolen to pay for Jensen's affair. The board members exchanged horrified glances as they calculated the potential legal and reputational damage. Embezzling charity funds was not only criminal, but would destroy Arlington Construction's standing in the community once the news became public. Jensen finally attempted to defend himself. "This is all being taken out of context. The money was temporary borrowing that I intended to repay. The relationship issues are private family matters that don't concern the business." "Actually," Arthur interjected, "the business concerns are extensive. Your personal conduct has created massive liability for Arlington Construction through fraudulent expense reports, theft of company funds, and misappropriation of charitable donations. The company faces potential criminal investigation and civil lawsuits." I reached into the envelope for the final revelation. Printed copies of Jensen's text messages detailing his plan to manipulate custody proceedings through false documentation of my parental fitness. But perhaps most damaging of all is evidence that Jensen has been systematically plotting to gain custody of Harry and Emma through fraudulent claims about my mental stability. Faith Arlington gasped audibly. "Custody? Jensen, what is she talking about?" I handed her copies of Jensen's messages to Camilla discussing strategies for documenting my supposed inadequacies as a mother. "Your son has been deliberately creating stressful situations, then recording my responses as evidence that I'm unfit for custody. He's been planning to take my children away from me based on manufactured evidence." "I have a proposition," he said simply. "Arlington Construction needs someone with your skills, integrity, and understanding of corporate accountability. We're restructuring our leadership team, and I'd like you to consider joining us as Chief Compliance Officer."
The irony was perfect. Jensen had spent years trying to position himself as the heir to Arlington Construction, only to lose that opportunity through his own criminal behavior. Now his father was offering his former wife the executive position Jensen had coveted. The board unanimously approved this offer, Clay continued. We need someone who understands that family businesses require family values, and you've proven that you'll fight to protect those values even when it's difficult. I thought about Jensen, currently serving his prison sentence while watching his family move on without him. He'd reduced me to just the babysitter, never imagining that the woman he dismissed would eventually hold a senior position at the company he'd hoped to inherit. The board unanimously approved this offer, Clay continued. We need someone who understands that family businesses require family values, and you've proven that you'll fight to protect those values even when it's difficult. I thought about Jensen, currently serving his prison sentence while watching his family move on without him. He'd reduced me to just the babysitter, never imagining that the woman he dismissed would eventually hold a senior position at the company he'd hoped to inherit. At home that evening, Harry and Emma helped me celebrate the job offer with ice cream. They were thriving in our new life. Harry's grades had improved dramatically once the stress of his father's manipulation was removed, and Emma had developed the confident personality of a child who felt truly secure. Are you going to be the boss of Daddy's old company? Harry asked with 6-year-old directness. I'm going to help make sure they always do the right thing, I replied. That's what integrity means, doing what's right even when nobody's watching. The house felt like home in a way it never had when Jensen lived here. His dismissive energy had been replaced by genuine warmth and stability. The children's friends played here regularly, and Faith and Clay visited every weekend, embracing their role as devoted grandparents. Jensen's name rarely came up in conversation anymore. He'd become a cautionary tale rather than a present reality, someone who'd made destructive choices and faced the consequences. The children understood that their father's absence was the result of his own decisions, not a reflection of their worth. Sometimes I wondered if Jensen had learned anything from his downfall. His letters from prison suggested he still viewed himself as the victim of circumstances rather than the architect of his own destruction. He'd apparently convinced himself that his crimes were justified by pressure and that his family had abandoned him unfairly. But that narrative was his problem to resolve, not mine. I'd spent enough years managing his emotions and protecting his image. Now my energy was focused on building the life my children deserved, one based on honesty, stability, and genuine love rather than manipulation and deceit. The woman Jensen had dismissed as just the babysitter was now the chief compliance officer of his family's company, the respected single mother raising his children, and the person responsible for ensuring that Arlington Construction never again employed someone willing to steal from charity funds to pay for extramarital affairs. He'd tried to make me invisible, but invisibility had been my greatest weapon. While he was busy planning my destruction, I was quietly building the case that would destroy him instead. Sometimes, the person you underestimate most is the one taking notes on everything you do wrong. And sometimes, justice is served by the very person you tried to dismiss as unimportant. Jensen had learned too late that when you call someone just the babysitter, you might discover that the babysitter is actually the one in charge.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.